The rusted silver roadster sat in the corner of the auxiliary lot like something the auction house had simply forgotten to bury. A thin film of grime blanketed the hood. The paint had curled away from the fenders in long, brittle strips, and the handwritten lot tag swinging from the door handle read $8,000. No reserve. No one stood near it. No one spared it a second glance. And then Elaine. Sharp black suit, arms folded, the kind of smile that had spent years practicing how to make people feel small, looked past the gleaming turntable and the flashing cameras, down toward the dim auxiliary corner, and found a man crouching beside that rusted heap with a small flashlight. A little girl stood at his shoulder, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, watching her father work. Elaine said it loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Get this cheap junk out of my sight, and take your trash with you." Samuel didn't stand up. He didn't argue. He didn't even look at her. He just kept the beam of his flashlight trained on the inner chassis with the slow, unhurried patience of a man who had already seen something the entire room had completely missed. What did Samuel see beneath that rust and silence that a hall full of high society experts walked right past? The answer would be worth $8 million. And it would force every single person in that room, especially Elaine, to learn the only lesson that had ever mattered. True value has never cared about the price of your suit. The guards didn't say a word. They didn't need to. Two of them simply materialized on either side of Samuel and began walking, and the message was clear enough: move or be moved. Samuel took Chloe's hand and walked. She was quiet, which was worse than crying. 7 years old and already learning how certain rooms made certain people feel. He could feel the small, tight grip of her fingers around his and the way she pressed her stuffed rabbit hard against her chest. The way she only did when she was trying very hard to hold something in. The auxiliary lot was everything the main hall was not. Low light, thick dust, the faint smell of rust and old rubber hanging in the stale air. Forgotten vehicles sat in uneven rows beneath a ceiling that hummed with dying fluorescence, each one wearing its neglect like a badge nobody wanted. Samuel crouched down beside her the moment the guards turned back. "Hey!" He kept his voice easy. "You know what this place is?" She looked around, unconvinced. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his flashlight, and pressed it into her small hands. "It's a treasure lot. The good stuff always hides where nobody thinks to look." He tilted his head toward the shadows. "Want to help me find it?" She clicked the flashlight on, swept the beam across the dusty floor like she was already taking the job seriously. Samuel stood slowly, and that's when he saw it. A severely faded silver roadster pushed against the far wall, half buried behind two gutted sedans. The paint had surrendered entirely along the rear haunches. The bodywork was dented, weathered, and utterly dismissed. But the roofline curve stopped him cold. He'd seen that shape before. A long time ago, in a book his father never let anyone else touch. The auxiliary auction drew maybe a dozen people, and even that felt generous. A bored clerk worked through the lot numbers with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. Bidders shuffled between vehicles, glancing, shrugging, moving on. The silver roadster earned nothing more than a few dismissive looks and at least one audible scoff from a man in a linen blazer who tapped its fender like he was checking whether it would simply collapse. Samuel wasn't listening to any of them. He was on his knees beside the driver's side, flashlight angled low against the inner firewall, and he was completely, utterly still. There, beneath a thick crust of grime and decades of accumulated shadow, a weld. Not a factory press weld. Not the clean, automated seam that a production line leaves behind. This was hand-stamped, deliberate, a specific diagonal tack pattern he had seen documented only once, in a single grainy photograph in the back of his father's most prized reference book. It was the signature of a designer who had built exactly 4 prototype chassis in his entire career before the workshop burned and the records disappeared. 3 of those 4 had already been accounted for. Samuel sat back on his heels and said nothing for a long moment. Then he closed his flashlight, stood up, and found the clerk. The bidding on the Roadster opened at 4,000. No one moved. The clerk raised an eyebrow and dropped it to 3. Still nothing. Samuel raised his hand at 8,500. From somewhere near the entrance, he heard laughter. A short, sharp burst from a pair of Elaine's assistants watching the auxiliary proceedings with the amusement of people observing a yard sale. The clerk brought the gavel down. Samuel looked at the car and allowed himself one quiet breath. The flatbed reached the garage just after 9. Samuel backed the Roadster off the ramp himself, guiding it slowly into the center bay while Chloe sat on the workbench in her pajamas, legs dangling, watching with the serious expression she reserved for things she had decided mattered. He let her stay up long enough to see the car under proper light. Then he carried her upstairs, listened for the particular quality of silence that meant she was genuinely asleep, and went back down. The work began. He started with the exterior, not because it was important but because it was honest, stripping away what the years had done on the surface before asking deeper questions. The rust came off in careful passes. The grime surrendered slowly beneath solvent and patience. He wasn't rushing. Rushing was how you miss things, and Samuel had built his entire life around the discipline of not missing things. By the second night, he was inside the engine bay. By the third, he was working the firewall with a soft brush and a magnifying lens, moving the way a surgeon moves, small, deliberate, unhurried. It was past midnight on the 4th night when he stopped breathing for a moment. The grime along the lower chassis rail had thinned enough to reveal stamped metal beneath. Not a repair stamp, not a parts number, but a full factory identification sequence pressed into the steel with a precision that belonged to a different era entirely. He cleaned around it with a cotton cloth, digit by digit, until the complete sequence was visible under his light. He set the cloth down, sat back on his stool. Then he reached for his father's reference book, still kept on the 3rd shelf exactly where it had always been, and opened it to the page he had never expected to need. The numbers matched perfectly. Samuel had the number written on a piece of workshop paper, folded once, sitting on the kitchen table when he made the call just after 6 in the morning. He hadn't slept. Dr. Raymond O'Kell had spent 40 years documenting European prototype chassis before retiring to a quiet house 2 states over. He didn't advertise. He didn't have a website. Samuel had found his name years ago in the acknowledgement section of the same reference book his father had kept on the 3rd shelf, credited simply as technical verification. He had held onto the contact number the way you hold onto something you hope you'll never actually need. O'Kell listened without interrupting as Samuel read the sequence aloud. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Read it again," O'Kell said quietly. Samuel read it again. Another silence. Longer this time. "I'll be there tomorrow morning." He arrived at 7. A trim man in his late 70s carrying a worn leather satchel and moving with the careful economy of someone who had learned not to waste motion. Samuel pulled back the workshop sheet without ceremony. O'Kell stopped walking. He stood at the entrance to the bay for a full 10 seconds, not moving, just looking at the car the way people look at things they had resigned themselves to never seeing. Then he set his satchel down, pulled on his examination gloves, and began, methodically, reverently, to verify everything Samuel had found. Took 2 hours. When O'Kell finally straightened up and turned around, his voice was entirely steady, which somehow made it more serious. This is the Moretti Series 0, the fourth prototype. Every record listed it as destroyed in the 1971 workshop fire. He removed his gloves slowly. Conservative market valuation, given full provenance documentation, sits between $7 and $9 million. Samuel nodded once and put the kettle on. He never found out who talked. It didn't matter. By the following afternoon, 3 separate people had called the shop asking questions Samuel didn't answer, and by evening a black SUV with tinted windows was idling in the narrow lot outside the garage bay. The man who stepped out was polished in the particular way that money worn as armor tends to look. Good shoes, practiced smile, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm like a prop he had used many times before. He introduced himself as a representative of a private acquisitions group. He said the word opportunity twice in the first minute. Samuel wiped his hands on a shop rag and waited. The man opened the portfolio on the workbench without being invited and slid a single page across the surface. A number sat near the bottom, clean and bold. $100,000. Cash. Immediate close. Samuel looked at the number. He didn't pick up the page. He was acutely aware, standing there under the buzzing shop lights, of exactly what was sitting in his bank account. The mortgage notice was still on the kitchen counter upstairs, the second one, the one with the firmer language. He was aware of Chloe asleep 2 floors above them, one worn stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, entirely unbothered by the specific mathematics of her father's life. The man let the silence sit the way people do when they've learned that silence does their negotiating for them. Samuel thought about the weld on the firewall. The serial number. O'Kell's voice going carefully, deliberately steady. $7 to $9 million. He thought about Chloe's face when she first swept the flashlight beam across that dusty floor, already taking the treasure hunt seriously. He folded the contract once and slid it back. "I think we're done," Samuel said. The provenance documentation took 2 days to assemble. O'Kell handled the authentication paperwork with the methodical precision of a man who understood that the difference between a remarkable claim and a verified fact was exactly this kind of patience: signed affidavits, cross-referenced chassis records, a formal written declaration from an independent European registry that had been tracking the Moretti Series 0 as a confirmed loss for over 50 years. When the final folder was complete, it was the kind of document that didn't ask for attention. Commanded it. Samuel drove to the auction house on a Tuesday morning and asked to speak with the registrations desk. The clerk who initially received him was polite in the distracted way of someone who had already decided the conversation would be brief. Samuel set the documentation folder on the counter and said nothing further. The clerk opened it, read the first page, and then read it again. Then she excused herself and came back with a manager. The manager read it standing up. Then he made a phone call. Within the hour, the Moretti Series 0 had been assigned a premier dedicated lot for the upcoming Saturday auction. Main hall, center stage, its own catalog entry. The kind of placement that wasn't offered. The kind that was legally difficult to refuse once the paperwork made the vehicle's historical status undeniable. Elaine found out sometime that afternoon. Samuel wasn't there to see it, but O'Kell had a contact inside the house who described it concisely. 3 corporate handlers in her office within 20 minutes, voices elevated, the particular panic of people calculating exactly how badly a missed $8 million prototype reflected on their professional reputation. Samuel was back in the workshop by 4 o'clock, running a final polish along the chassis rail, unhurried and entirely unsurprised. Some things he had learned simply needed the right document and enough patience. 7 days. That was all the distance that separated the man being escorted out of a side exit by security guards from the man walking through the main entrance holding his daughter's hand. Samuel dressed the same way he always dressed. Clean work trousers, a plain collared shirt, the same worn jacket. Chloe had insisted on carrying her stuffed rabbit, and he had not argued the point. They walked through the main doors together at 10 minutes past 9, and if Samuel felt anything particular about crossing that threshold, he kept it in the same quiet place he kept most things. The hall had transformed for the premiere auction. The lighting was warmer, the catalog thicker, the crowd denser with the particular energy of serious money preparing to move. Collectors who flew in from 3 continents stood in small clusters, catalog pages marked, conversations low and purposeful. At precisely 9:30, the side doors opened and the Moretti Series 0 was rolled onto the main stage. It had not been restored. That had been a deliberate decision, one Samuel had made on the 3rd night in the workshop and never reconsidered. The car came in exactly as it had been found, its silver paint curled and faded, its bodywork carrying every decade of its hidden existence openly. The raw, weathered patina sat under the warm auction lights like a statement. The room changed the moment it appeared. It was subtle at first. A few heads turning, a catalog lowered, a conversation trailing off mid-sentence. Then a collector near the front said a single word, barely audible, that rippled outward through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Within 30 seconds, the room was completely silent. Not the polite silence of an auction waiting to begin. The stunned, reverent silence of people who had just understood exactly what they were looking at. The auctioneer opened at $1 million with the measured calm of a man who had learned never to show surprise, and the room answered immediately. 2 paddles went up before he finished the sentence. What followed was not the usual rhythm of a high-end auction. The considered pauses, the theatrical hesitations, the careful posturing of buyers performing patience for one another. This was something rawer and faster, driven by the particular urgency of collectors who recognized that what sat on that stage would not appear again in their lifetimes. The bids came in overlapping waves, international phone lines feeding numbers through relay agents stationed along the sidewall, paddle numbers firing across the room in quick, sharp succession. 2 million, then 3. A pause of perhaps 4 seconds before 4 million arrived from the phone bank on the left. Samuel stood at the back of the hall with Chloe beside him. She had stopped watching the stage and was watching her father instead, the way children do when they sense that something important is happening that they will want to remember. He kept his eyes forward, his expression unchanged, his hands easy at his sides. Up on the VIP balcony, Elaine stood at the railing. She had arrived composed. She was no longer composed. The color had left her face in the methodical way that genuine shock tends to take it. Not all at once, but steadily, as each new number erased the possibility that the previous one had been the ceiling. 5 million. 6. A long, crackling 10 seconds before 7 million came quietly from a phone line registered to a private European collector. Then 8 million and silence. The auctioneer let it breathe for exactly 3 seconds. The gavel came down like a period at the end of a very long sentence. The lobby emptied slowly the way auction halls do after something historic. People lingering, voices still carrying the particular electricity of witnessed events. Catalog pages folded and refolded in hands that hadn't quite finished processing what they'd seen. Samuel was helping Chloe with her jacket when he heard the heels on the marble floor and looked up. Elaine stopped a few feet away. The sharp composure that had filled every inch of her the week before was present but reorganized somehow, rearranged around something she was visibly still working out how to carry. She looked at Samuel, then briefly at Chloe, then back at Samuel. She opened her mouth once and closed it. It was, he suspected, not a sensation she had much experience with. "I misjudged you," she said finally. Simple. Direct. The words of someone who had decided that anything more elaborate would only make it worse. Samuel nodded once, without edge and without performance. "True value is found under the hood," he said quietly. "Not in the price of the suit." He glanced down at Chloe, who was watching Elaine with the calm, unreadable assessment of a 7-year-old who had already formed her own conclusions. "She taught me that, actually." He took his daughter's hand and walked out through the main doors into the pale morning light. The trust was established the following week. Structured, protected, designed to carry Chloe through every door she chose to walk through. The workshop building was purchased outright on a Thursday. The deed signed at a table in the same office where the mortgage notices had been arriving for months. The last thing Samuel hung in the garage was a single framed photograph. The Moretti Series 0 exactly as he had found it, rusted and forgotten and worth everything, sitting in the corner of a dim auxiliary lot where nobody had thought to look. He centered it carefully on the wall above the workbench, stepped back, and went to work. If this story moved you, stayed with you, or reminded you of something important, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe and leave a like. Every share puts this in front of someone who might be standing in their own auxiliary lot right now, flashlight in hand, wondering if what they're looking at is worth anything. It might be worth everything.